And hello, everyone from all around the world. Welcome again to Working Class Revolt number 53. And today I'm going to be chairing it. And also, too, before we start, I'd like to acknowledge I'm actually broadcasting from the land of the Jar Jar Wurrung here in central Victoria. And I'd like to pay acknowledgement to their elders, past, present, and future, and acknowledge that their struggle of the Indigenous people was a struggle against invasion of their own countries. It was an anti colonial struggle, but also now it's part of a greater struggle against imperialism. And I like to acknowledge that they're our natural allies in this struggle and always remind ourselves that black and white, we need to fight against these imperialists. So once again, I'll also welcome fellow host, co-host Dust James, all the way from North Carolina. How are you going today? You're on mute. You're on mute, Dust. No, Dust, you're on
Oh,
mute.
good. Yeah. All right. Thank you, brother. Thank you, brother, for that good introduction. Thanks for chairing the meeting and setting up this special Australia Day, Invasion Day, better called. I'm looking forward to learning more about this and tying in, as somebody from a fellow former colony as well as an imperialist country. I'm looking forward to today. Thank you.
Thank you. And also, we'd like to also welcome a guest on with us again who likes to actually go by the nickname of Benign. We do like to have a bit of a sense of humour here. So, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, Dave.
Well, look, it's going to be a very important note coming up this week. Obviously, January the 26th, which is the so-called National Day, and otherwise known as Australia Day, but a lot of us call it, it's a lot of being well known as Invasion Day or National Sorry Day. 26th of January in 1788 actually was the foundation of a penal colony, New South Wales. It was not the foundation of Australia, which we will go further on in that discussion. But we like to open this up as a good discussion today in relation to about moving forward, about a republic, what democracy means for us, which will be further in discussion, and also too related with the American experience and the struggle against imperialism. So I'd like to actually open up with Nada. Would you like to make any comments about that? Sorry,
yeah.
Benign.
No, don't worry. Don't worry. Yeah, so where to begin? As Dave said, Australia Day or Invasion Day, whatever you want to call it, is 26th January. It's the day the first fleet arrived in Botany Bay in New South Wales, what we'll call the New South Wales colony. And it's a very controversial, especially in recent years, it's become a huge cultural point of struggle. You see a lot of, it's very split down the middle in terms of how the Australian people feel about it. There's a lot of people who are very passionately against Australia Day, particularly on the left. Obviously, there's also, and the reasoning behind them is obviously very varied. There's different ideological and sort of political positions regarding the day. It's more of like I said, it's a cultural sticking point. It's not really the core of the matter, but it's a very relevant cultural war issue. And I think it's a good point to sort of give our kind of more materialist sort of point of view about the founding of this country, its modern origins, I should say, in terms of its contemporary history. And so where to go from here? I think the first thing we should probably talk about is what is what's the word? What is the significance of the day for the Aboriginal people? Because this is obviously where it first is concerned. Obviously, none of us are Aboriginal. We should just say that. Obviously, so we're not going to spend too much time just speaking on behalf of what they say because it's not really our place, I guess. But I think that obviously there's a lot of animosity towards the day because it's obviously the founding of their invasion of their country. So it carries a lot of civilizational trauma, I guess, because it was the start of the end in a lot of ways and the start of a genocide as well. So it's obviously something that we want to treat with a level of sensitivity, but we also want to get to the heart of it. So David, what do you think in terms of how how we should approach it as materialists, I suppose, as opposed to just being sort of more the moralist position, which we can get into as well.
Well, I think it is a very good question about actually having a material perspective on it, and obviously it's got to be more than just change the date, which has been one of the latest demands. And I'm not knocking that demand, but I think we've got to do a lot more than that, but change the whole situation. It's the old term of we need to change the system as well, and I think look where we're tied up in as Australia, as it is currently where it stands now, also where we stand within the rest of the world, and I think also too, also to understand our history very clearly. I mean, Australia did not start in 1788; it's been here for tens and thousands, with people on it for tens and thousands of years. I mean, it's an ancient continent, no doubt about that, and then all. But I think a lot of people understand it's like, no, the nation wasn't founded, first of all, correctly on the 26th of January. In fact, our nation formed on the 1st of January 1901, when there was, after the push of the Federation movement of the 1880s, 1890s to finally bring all the colonies together to form the Commonwealth of Australia, which was all approved by the British Parliament, Act of British Parliament at the time. I think I understand too, it wasn't, but this was also too to lead up to that. There was all these series of struggles, not from just from the Indigenous point, but also through the Goldfields rebellions, the great Union strikes, the 1880s and 1890s, and all these things, the friendly societies, etc. But there was a genuine push that we wanted to actually form our own way here, away from that tyranny of British colonial rule. I think it's something that's been sadly lost, where it's been so commercialised and corporatised, and grown that we. And I just what gets me too. It's like how we want to include everybody. We're so tolerant here and everything else, but today I see a so country divided and toxic. And it hasn't really come to a good reckoning and realisation of itself. So it definitely needs a good materialist analysis and understanding of our history. And not a whitewash of it either.
Yeah, definitely. And the history of this country is probably one of the things I'm the most passionate about, because it's so seldom taught. You get the kind of cliff notes in school. You're told about the First Fleet. You're told about the Goldfields. You're told about these particular little snapshots of history. Even the Indigenous history these days, you're taught about it. But it doesn't give you a picture of the material development of the country, particularly its origins. Yes, first as penal colony, that's obvious, but also its commercial side. It being founded as an agrarian export, particularly of wool, and to feed the Manchester machine of the Industrial Revolution that was happening in Britain. There's a whole side of it, particularly, and also in the consequence, the aftermath of the American Revolution, because obviously Australia was founded after the sort of British lost control over the American continent, or sorry, the United States. Obviously, they still had Canada. Good, Dust is back. Because I just mentioned America, and I wanted to actually kind of link this to you, Dust. It's kind of strange that we have Australia Day be the day of the First Fleet, because it's kind of like it's kind of like if America had Independence Day being Columbus Day, being like the same date as just when the Europeans came to the continent. It's kind of strange, isn't it? It's like, because we don't have an Independence Day, because we technically have never been independent. That's kind of the key of the issue, is that America founded a republic against the colonial empire, and Australia didn't. We became a dominion. And so even our federation, even the federation date that you mentioned, David, even that is not actually the same, comparable to a national day that you would have in America with like the 4th of July, because federation was obviously, I think, a first step in the sense of a unified Australian continent, but it was also not it was not independent. When federation happened, Australia was still very much dependent on Britain, and independent consciousness was already developing, obviously, well before that. But in terms of its actual formal, official, legal, and like sovereignty-wise, we were still very much part of the broader Commonwealth, the British Empire. We were still very much part of it. So even from that perspective, we don't have a national day. And I think a lot of people want a national day. I think this is where like a lot of the sort of pushback from like, and where I kind of understand why like half the population do not really want the date to change. I don't really want anything to change as far as the celebration of Australia Day is concerned, is because it's really just about Australia Day. It's called Australia Day. It's a national day. And despite the fact that, we acknowledge that this is sort of like a wrong day, we have to sort of also understand why it is that half the people in this country, more than half even, I think it's like 60%, don't really want this to change, or at the very least, like they're not particularly gung-ho about the sort of way that it's sort of presented as a false dichotomy between invasion and Australia Day, because I think it's just people want Australia Day. People want to feel some kind of sense of national unity, I suppose. And I think that this is where I'd come from in terms of how we can, I suppose, bridge the gap, because it's a very polarizing issue. Like I said, it's a culture war issue. Every single 26th of January, there's these huge marches in the major cities. Thousands and thousands of people who, they call for the end of Australia Day, and it's massively polarizing, because you have like a lot of like really kind of I think this is where like a lot of people kind of despise it, is the sort of like Calvinist side, where it's like Australia was sort of born out of original sin. And in a sense, there is a truth to this, in the sense that like obviously there was a genocide that followed invasion. So obviously that's a massive sin, so to speak. Yeah. But is that all there is in terms of the history of this country, the modern history? Because obviously, as David mentioned, history goes back tens of thousands of years, but there is relevancy to say that the modern history started around then, because everything changed after that. When a white man came to this country, that's when we have the modern Australia as we know it. So there is relevancy to like sort of mark the point of historical distinction. But yeah, so as far as the comparison between America and Australia goes, I think this is a good time to talk about the issue of this Republic question, because this is what differentiates America's 4th of July with our January 26th. And Dust, how do people in America feel about the 4th of July, particularly on the left? I'm imagining not very positively, but I'm interested to see the comparison.
Yes. Thank you, Benign. Sorry, my battery went out on this phone. I heard most of what you guys are saying, and I'm hearing a lot of echo. It was a big, as far as U.S. patriotism in general has been a huge like journey for me. I think early on, when I started getting into leftism, I was angry. I couldn't stand 4th of July celebrations, especially coming up right during the Bush era, being against the war. And you'd hear chants of USA, USA, USA. And what that meant further, national oppression. That means police brutality against indigenous people and African Americans and Chicanos. That meant the murder of Iraqi people. That's kind of what it means. But this is all moralistic. This is all like this has nothing to do with the system change itself. Is what we're trying to do is Marxists. But I had to go through that journey, from hating it to coming back around to it, to seeing, okay, this is the working class. What are the positive elements, social elements of patriotism? And those are, people wanting to come together, the multiracial aspects of patriotism, the patriotism of Paul Robeson and William Z. Foster. And you start to look at it, and I come to it from a material standpoint of, as far as superstructure, any means necessary. So we can use, Chicano nationalists and black nationalists burning the flag and getting the people angry against national oppression. At the same time, we can use progressive voices using the flag symbol in progressive ways. And one of the ways that the United States is unique to the world, that people recognize from Latin America, to Ho Chi Minh is that this was one of the first major large-scale Republican revolutions against feudalism and colonialism. And the U.S. Revolution inspired the Latin American revolutions, inspired Ho Chi Minh to kick out the French, and then later on kick out the United States itself. So it's complicated, but my position is any means necessary, and the system is, and the goal, by any superstructure necessary, any any not really ideological, but any appeal to any mass appeal that is necessary and is effective at mobilizing the masses, building workers' power, building power of oppressed nations, and then building the alternative systems necessary to oppose the system and build the more advanced system. I mean, that's a short answer to a very large and complex question.
That's great. Actually, it really resonated because when I first became into left-wing kind of spheres, I also kind of had that same sort of experience. It was, I mean, I've always been anti-American, but that's not really relevant because I'm not I'm not American. But as far as Australia goes, that was definitely how I started, where I was like, this country is like just nothing but genocide. It's just it's just pure negativity. It's like awful, and it was hard to see any kind of positive content out of this country, the modern history. And that's where a lot of lefties are. They're like one of the, like, when you go to these protests, which I've been to quite a few of them, the Invasion Day, the Australia Day protests, there's a lot of radical slogans. They go as far as to say abolish Australia. But that's a very common one you see, abolish Australia. And it's the kind of like anarchistic, or almost like sort of like return to capitalist conditions impulse. It's a kind of like it's something that you see very often, but interestingly enough, you see it often from white radicals. You don't really often see it from actually coming from Indigenous communities themselves. It's this very kind of like it is this kind of Calvinistic view where it's just it can only see the negativity of this country, and it can't grasp any kind of positive content out of it. And I would go even so far as to say that when you look at the penal origins of this country, that is actually where a ton of our national character of our working class comes from. Because when the penal colony was established, a lot of political prisoners were sent here. There were prisoners of obviously the working class struggle that was emerging in Britain, in Wales, in all the industrial centres of the UK that was there, and also a ton of Irish Republicans as well, who were also inspired by the American Revolution. So this was a sort of fervour that was in the air, and this sort of origin, obviously with the working class, also the Chartist movement as well, if you're aware of the Chartists, sort of early working class movement in that country. All of these things kind of came out of, like, they were all kind of bubbling under the surface, even in the penal origins. So, like, obviously the colonial administrative side of things, that's obviously easy to sort of condemn as, this sort of like British colonial rule. But even within this origin, as modern origin, as penal colony, there is still positive aspects there in terms of the people who were sent here. The people who were sent here were innocent. For the most part, they'd stole a loaf of bread, or they were fighting for their country against the British Empire. And this is something that, like, I think that any kind of communists in this country need to embrace is a sort of positive side of its modern, origins. I think that if we to do that, because I think it also reflects, I think, the contemporary situation as well. A lot of people, especially in America, they see Australia and the way we've gone with COVID as like completely authoritarian and completely off the charts. And really, this is just a continuation of the sort of penal mindset that Australia still kind of holds. We still kind of consider it, like, I would say that, like, really we've never escaped being a penal colony in a lot of ways. It's still with us, because we're not independent. We're not a republic. We have this sort of like a colonial mindset where we don't even see ourselves. We don't even really stand up for ourselves. And it's telling that our nationalists, our so-called nationalists, are all monarchists. They don't even believe in this country being an independent civilization. they really just sort of have fealty to the empire. And that's like pathetic. It's like a real cucked attitude. They don't even see Australia as being something that is outside of the dominion of the empire. And that's why I look to America for inspiration as well, you know, in the same way that Ho Chi Minh, the same way that all these Latin American, national liberation struggles, I think we can also look to that, because I think a lot of Australians, we have an anti-Americanism, but it's a kind of a crude anti-Americanism where we just sort of like see, oh, well, we have healthcare, or we have, X, Y, and Z, like institutions which are better than America. But really, I think it's kind of a cope to the fact that we aren't, like, there is some things to admire about America. There is something, that we can take from them. But if we just have a kind of like a dismissive attitude towards that, and we kind of have this sort of like, we kind of just defend our own institutions, we kind of do ourselves a disservice, because America has a lot of things to teach us about how to oppose the British Empire, because we still have to deal with that. We're still on a republic. So I'll let David go on there.
Yeah, look, there's a lot to cover, and also with the comments as well. I mean, look, some things have to deal with sensitivity. I mean, I can understand the First Nations or Indigenous people here being correctly angry about it. And I think one thing is we do need to listen to them and listen to what they're trying to teach us as well, because none of them are talking about reversing history. You can't reverse history. You've got to keep going forward. And I think we have to learn from them, and I also acknowledge that they constituted their own countries and stuff. At the end of the day, they had their own culture, their own arts, their own way of doing things. And we had to acknowledge that, and also acknowledge what happened to them. And still thinks they're still actually to this day forming a lot of injustices. I think the one about Abolish Australia, to me, that title, it doesn't achieve anything at all. It's just where it puts the wedge in further. I don't know how you're going to do that. What we're going to do, put sink all the landmass under sea or something, so you never see it again. Like the mysterious Atlantis. I mean, I don't look. That's wrong. If they're meaning about actually looking at all their statute laws, the statute, things that from that colonial era, which was carried over both on the state and federal or national side of it, we should look at all that. But also, it's more. You've got to change more than the law. You've got to change the system. Dust correctly pointed out about economic base and superstructure. Our economic base determines the superstructure now, and this is where it all came again. This is where it all is now. And I have to say, we're not living in 1901 anymore. We're not living in the 1800s. We're living in now the third decade of the 21st century, and our institutions are up there to hold the power of the multinationals. And I think we're talking about independence and that. This is where we've got to get back to the economic base and challenge this power. Who runs us overall? And you're quite right. These people also too, without trying to jump all over the place. The nationalists here that wave the current flag and else, and all they are, traditionally all they're national chauvinists, but they're not for a republic. They've got a long history, especially the far right movement and all that. They've been staunch monarchists. Even though they believe in the rule of the monarchy and governor general and all that, they don't even believe really rights in bourgeois political power. So that's something we got to look at where we want to. Obviously, where we have this discussion here, a lot of us we want to, when we're talking about advancing Australia or moving forward with it. I think it's basically we want to make Australia a better place than what we found it, and certainly we need to. The system we live under, because what we're facing now, and I also want to bring on the economic, what we're facing now is economic catastrophe. It's more than, by a lot of people, a lot of economic uncertainty. It's not just because of what happened about COVID. COVID's part of it, but it just fast-tracked everything. There's a lot of things out there, and people have got a lot of big concerns. But even going back to what we want to talk about, a republic and all that, I remember years ago when the republic debate was happening, when I was involved in I voted in that referendum back in 1999. I voted yes for a republic. However, the fact is, that was completely undermined. But it was actually a discussion at the time. Well, what type of republic do we just want to change the head, and that's it? Nothing changes. Governor General to a president, or and that's it. Mills approach, or we want to do a lot more with it. And that was an interesting discussion I got in with some people, because we've got such a history of and quite rightly for rebellion and stuff from all those forebears that came for us in the 1800s and also 1900s. They had this vision, and obviously quite rightly wanted achieved for. But I know something about the history of Australia, even its modern history. It always been consistently undermined all the time, and we come to this positions like where we are now and all that. So it certainly is means for us in Australia. I mean, with the US side of things, I mean, obviously for those US comrades, we didn't. I mean, we had struggles and so, but it wasn't like an actual war of independence we had. It's the British colonial powers as such, compared to what was in the US. But I mean, as I said, it was an act of British Parliament that allowed, and that was actually because of both British capital was actually rather annoyed by having to pay tariffs of goods were crossing borders between the respective colonies, and also hinders in trade and all that as well. So they basically allowed this. Yes, you can make it be a self-governing nation, but obviously there's still strings attached. British capital still remains supreme, and even for many years we still had to answer to the Privy Council, basic permission and that from the Privy Council to develop our own industries. And obviously the policies are put in from the early 1900s onwards, the ones that were very anti-working class, anti-indigenous, anti-everything else. I mean, it's certainly shocking, but that was all part and parcel. But the other side of the coin was there was a struggle against it all the time. So now I think that's what we've got to tap into that spirit of that struggle again. Mm.
Yeah, definitely.
Dust, did you want to?
I think there's a lot I can respond to. There's actually a little bit of overlap between North Carolina specifically, as well as the South in relation to Australia and the Scots-Irish versus the British blood question. And in my state of North Carolina, it has always been a so-called backwards, undeveloped state. And part of that has to do with the Outer Banks. The Outer Banks were a set of islands that are slightly off the coast that made the state of North Carolina not have the ability to have ports, to have port cities. So there's actually some interesting history. So a lot of the people that came here, was always a port state, were mostly Scottish and Irish, at least at the beginning. And there's an interesting history of piracy, where pirates would steal from the crown in Charleston, South Carolina, and then even famous pirates like Blackbeard would then sell to the outlaw, mostly Scottish, Irish, North Carolinians. And then as North Carolina started getting more and more developed, a lot of the Scottish and Irish people, which were common throughout the South, were pushed out of the mainland, which started to become farms, slavery farms, and were pushed up into the mountains. So there's a huge number of Scottish-Irish heritage in Appalachia. And Appalachia became the coal mining region. And it has been historically exploited and in poverty ever since. Horrible conditions, huge wars. The largest multiracial uprising in the United States was 1921, Battle of Blair Mountain, where Black people, Indigenous people, Scottish, Irish people living in script had thousands of people mass uprising against the sheriffs, and they were eventually bombed by the U.S. military. So there's a lot of that, and there's a lot of this kind of outlaw, kind of not hooked in with the elitist, the coastal cities and stuff, going back into the heartland all the way through the South. So there's a little bit of that. But usually those people that have that kind of renegade history, they've been so infected and so brainwashed with racism that we see some of the outlaw culture, like Jesse James was neo-Confederate. So there's problems with neo-Confederacy. But if you look at it, those who are taught and pushed into that ideology are actually some of the poorest. And you see this come full circle with the Rainbow Coalition, which was an alliance led by the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, which were Puerto Ricans, and economic refugees from the South, who actually were treated worse than the broad population because they were the South. And you get these negative stereotypes of incest, of being backwards, the making fun of hillbillies, making fun of rednecks, that you see that just justifies the class oppression. These are social constructs that justify class oppression. It's done in very similar ways that oppressed people are justified their national oppression. So this links between class oppression, national oppression, and then internationally, this old British versus the Scotch-Irish is still playing out in the South-North and the rural urban divide. And I think there's a lot of points for unity. Now, as far as the unique part of the United States being Republican, they're at the academics, the culturally woke, bourgeois, liberal academics are trying to rob us of our revolutionary history with the 1776 movement, in the name of justice for African American people and justice for indigenous people. They're painting the British Empire as the good people in the war, in the American Revolution. So it's absolutely backwards. Yes, the British had a law against expanding further territory, but that wasn't because they didn't want to exploit the indigenous people. That's because they wanted to keep the colony under control. And yes, for some slaves were offered freedom to fight on the cause of the empire, but overall, the cause of anti-colonialism is always better than the cause of colonialism. And instead of trying to rewrite this history to divide people and to make the British Empire look good and to demonize your average regular working class American, we need to find solidarity, and we need to draw on our revolutionary history. That means we kicked out the British. And now it's time that the oppressed people and the workers kick out the monopoly capitalists that are flooding our communities from the hood to the holler with opioids, that are denying us health care, that are denying us fair wages. We have to build a coalition of oppressed people and workers against the main enemy, which is the monopoly capitalists.
Definitely. I think that's interesting, the whole mention the 1619 project. Sort of like a rehabilitation of the British Empire. I find that so strange because it's such a like, I don't know, because at the time the British Empire was literally like the most brutal force in the world. There was like, even at like where the conditions of the penal colony here were like unbelievable. They were like at comparable to slavery in terms of just how brutal those conditions were. Obviously, it wasn't literal slavery. Like, people weren't like bought and owned in the way that the Black Americans were, but it was absolutely brutal, and that, not to mention obviously what else they were doing around the world. So I find that just absolutely stunning, and how ubiquitous that's been kind of taken up by the American left. They don't even realize sort of what they're doing. But anyway, the point about unity as well. I think we had a little brief exchange on Facebook about the land question, because this is very central to the Indigenous question here as well, and the question of Australia, because if you listen to Aboriginal people themselves, their main demand is land. It's always been land. It's not this like, virtue signal, sort of like, symbolic gesture. It's about land. And I think that this is the kind of the difference between a kind of a communist program and the kind of abolish Australia, return all the land to the Indigenous sort of like thing. It kind of ignores the fact that, like, what is land? Land is the most fundamental means of production. You can't have an economy, you can't have any kind of means of production without land to be on it first. It's a very basic point. But we kind of forget that land is a means of production. So I think that when we talk about the land question, this is really the point of unity. there's this interesting political phenomenon in the countryside in Australia, which is Bob Catter, kind of represented by Bob Catter, which is sort of his very anti-monopolist or anti-duopoly between Coles and Woolworths, which are these major agricultural monopolies that control the entire agricultural supply chain in this country. And there's this real tension between the small farmer and these big monopolists, because they just squeeze and exploit the small farmer when it comes to prices for milk and all sorts of agricultural products. And I think that this is why I said this is a point of unity, is because really, if communists had any sense, they would recognize that there is a commonality between these particular struggles. Obviously, this also goes down to the sort of divide in terms of the water system with the Murray-Darling Basin. We have a lot of upstream versus downstream. There's a whole lot of internal contradictions in this country which are totally unexplored, and it's uninterested. The Australian left is very uninterested in these sort of questions, because it's not this sort of a punchy thing where it's just talking about oppression all the time. It's all about oppression, when I feel like that's only one side of it. Oppression is symptomatic of something deeper, a deeper material thing that's happening. And the question of land is really central to how we can create unity, land and the Republic, obviously. So I think that as far as we go forward, I think that we have to have a better view about the sort of role of monopoly. And the monopoly takes multiple forms. There's obviously the literal landed monopoly. There's the multinational monopolies that flood the country. And there's also the sort of digital monopolies that are emerging as well. So I think that when we take this position, because the monopoly question is also very linked to the democratic question, obviously, as well. If we look to Russia, this was also the question of the landed monopolies and the peasantry. This is an age-old question. So the question of the democratic struggle in Australia is unfinished, because we don't have the Republic. The democratic struggle in this country is not complete. I think I can't remember which Communist Party. It might have been the CPA-ML, but they had this theory about Australia being like a semi-colony still. And it's a really interesting point, because what is Australia's economy right now? We used to have manufacturing, we used to have a more industrial sector, but the vast majority, I think it's like 2/3 of the economy is raw material exports, which is similar that you would have in much of the third world. Where like the primary export is just raw materials, and then we have like a service sector, and it's a very subservient position to be in. It's not a real like economy. We have this sort of fake economy of obviously, and the mines aren't even owned by the people, so like we don't even see the benefits of selling our resources. Which I'm not against selling our resources, but the profits all go to these mining magnates. They don't even go to the Australian people. So there's a lot of things going on as far as the question of monopoly, the question of the democratic struggle, and I think this is where the Australian communists have to come in terms of synthesizing all of these particular concrete struggles into one, because because that's always been the thing, the task of Bolshevism, right? The entire task is this unity between the democratic struggle and the class struggle. They happen simultaneously. It's not like a stages thing. They can happen at the same time. And a real powerful message of real authentic Australian patriotism that actually believes in this country and believes in its people and its land and wants it to be for the Australian people and for like the Australian working class. That is a very positive message, which contrasts with the left here, which is just pure, Calvinist self-hatred. And I think that if we really do foster this, we can actually see a revival of this question. But it requires a lot of humility in terms of what we know and how we talk about this, because like I said, like the dominance of the Calvinist side is just really strong, and we have to push back against it. We have to be kind of merciless against those sort of sides, which kind of poison the well in terms of moving forward as a people, as a working class. So yeah, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts, David?
Yeah, there's a lot there. Just before we go on, your audio was playing up a little bit, but hopefully it should clear up. That's all. So if you want, I'll just put you on mute while we speak, just to try and eliminate any of that audio interference. Just let me know that works. Yeah, I mean, look, where we are now, and I think it's the monopoly capitalists. I mean, the monopoly on agriculture, on distribution. There's a monopoly on practically everything we can think of, all modes of production, and that's going to be a primary struggle against it. I mean, it also too. I think just relating to about being a semi-colony and other things. I mean, Australia in its own right. I mean, still needs permission from Washington in order to do things from overseas. It usually gets its permission. It can do it has its own interests, but obviously, if it wants to advance it further, it needs its permission from Washington, so it's not affecting Washington or Wall Street's interests either, and even British interests to a certain degree. And I think that we're talking about like moving forward as a nation, and what type of nation. I think that's going to have to be also the struggle against that as well, because reality is we have to take control of our own affairs, and we can't allow it to be into the hands of the very wealthy anymore, the multinationals and all that. And I think what I'm looking at is, COVID's actually exposed all that. It's been a struggle against it's been a struggle between mainly two forces about who's got control of the agenda. I mean, from everything and everything you can think of, and I think it's blatantly obvious. I mean, it's blatantly obvious to people like ourselves, but for many other people, it doesn't seem so at the moment. On the surface, it looks completely different. It might be just a change of government or whatever. It's not. It is a struggle now. I think where COVID certainly exposed that we need to get control of our affairs and our own destination again, and really put Australia back on a path of its own future, not let it be dominated by multinationals or monopoly capitalism. By international finance, etc., which just seems to be dictating policy. And one of the things you highlighted, I mean, I'm talking to a lot of people. They go on about the original Lima agreements of the 70s and stuff there, right through to all the current free trade agreements, which would basically just wipe national sovereignty off the face there and leave us up to the dictates of monopoly capital. My understanding that came in the back of a crisis of capitalism, worldwide capitalism back then at the end of the 1960s. So that's something we're still living with that to this day and dealing with that. And I think where our struggles have been, we've sort of been just touching the surface, or just with little facets of it, not seeing the whole thing in a complete whole. That's the system itself. As I said, look, going back to even to what I was saying earlier, I mean, I supported the Republic back in 1999. Still, of course I would. But the reality is, in day, we've got to do a lot more than that and just change a head of state, or even just change a date and a few other little things. It's the whole system that needs to be changed, because even the same system we're living in, it might feel good. Yep, we can elect our own president. But the fact is, at the end of the day, we've got to understand is what we're living under now is, some people call global, and we're still we're suffering the consequences of all these neoliberal policies on its behalf. Dust or no, I just put you on mute. Sorry about that, but I put you on mute to stop any interference. That's all.
That's all right. Sorry, there's a lot of I don't know what the interference is on my end. I might be the air conditioner. Actually, it's bloody hot here. Can you hear me all right? Is it all right? Okay, good. You mentioned the referendum, because I was like 2 years old when the referendum happened, so I did not vote in it. One thing that was really kind of curious about that referendum, and looking at the history now, is particularly how the comparisons was between the parliament electing the president and the people there being a popular president, similar to the American system. And as far as I know, from what I can tell from like looking at the sources at the time, that the more American system was actually more popular among the people. But it's very much not popular among Parliament, among politicians, who would very much rather be the ones who elected the president. And recently, I actually saw this article by none other than bloody hell, what's his name? The former PM after Bob Hawke. What's his name? Sorry. Oh, I should know this. I should absolutely know this. Keating, yeah,
Okay.
Keating. There was this article. I don't know if it was in Sydney Morning Herald or something, but he was talking about how we can't do we got to be careful when it comes to the republic because you don't want a Trump situation. You don't want the stupid Australian people to elect a populist that can like this article was just the most like pathetic naked sort of uh, it's sort of where like the whole like Trump hysteria kind of leads to. It's this anti-popular sentiment, like for all the obvious criticisms that we can have of Trump, Trump like his populism is a threat, that at least that kind of positioning in relationship to an establishment, and politicians naturally know when like something is a threat to them, and it's why they vehemently oppose, that which undermines their established, institutional power, and there is something very powerful about having a popular elected president, which is, like in terms of its relationship to the rest of parliament. I don't know. I think it's something that they're very afraid of. They're afraid of that kind of side of the American system. And I don't think the Australian people are afraid of that, but I think they are. And I think this is sort of where I wanted to connect to the American thing and this issue of populism, this issue of because when we elect a government, we're just electing a local MP, and then we vote for our Senate, which is a proportional representation system of the state. So you just vote for a party, basically, and it's this very indirect thing. So like there's in Australia, there's no direct power that we speak to. There's no president that we elect. So everyone is very estranged from politics here, whereas in America, it seems to be very hyper political. In Australia, like, it's a sort of joke that more people find American politics interesting than Australian politics. People follow the American presidency like very closely in here, and they don't really follow Australian politics at all. And I think that part of it does come down to there is no power that we're speaking to in terms of like directly from a popular position. It's very intermediate, it's very mediated, and that's sort of like the real rubbish aspect of the British parliamentarian system is that this sort of like it always engenders an apathy, like a serious apathy towards politics. Which and like one thing I do admire about America is how energized people are, and how willing they are to like defend their rights, defend their civil liberties. Um, and I don't know. I think that it's there's something we can learn from, as well as something obviously there's a lot to learn from in the other sense from America, like what not to do. But I don't know. I think that there is the fact that Australian people largely wanted the directly elect their president, which that's kind of shocking, right? um, it shouldn't surprise anyone. It shouldn't surprise anyone.
Hmm. Yeah, that's right. I mean, look, just on the history there was in the late 1990s there was a campaign. The campaign for the Republic has been going on for many years, and obviously it was the big Yes campaign for it, and it got deliberately sabotaged. I pretty much John Howard by then was the Prime Minister of Australia and he deliberately distorted the question to such a degree as well, where basically, yeah, it was the parliamentary model where the parliamentary will nominate the president instead. Because currently, at the moment, the prime minister or the parliament nominates the governor general. Recommends it to the Queen to be appointed, where it was just basically a change of statute blocks the Parliament or the Prime Minister of recommendations with the President, where a lot of people that were pro-Republican didn't like that model at all. I think it's probably in our blood now, but we just do not trust Parliament at all. Just quoting a lifelong historical Australian poet, Henry Lawson, says about Australia, says, doesn't matter who forms government, everyone will hate it. At the end of the day, and it's just a common distrust. So it basically is and it was also you could all look under the undermined thing. It was so well, hang on, we wanted to grab a little control of the agenda here. We didn't want to leave up to even back then in the 1990s. We weren't going to trust any politicians and stuff to nominate the president, and you could see that deliberately in a way split the Republican. Vote for that way in the sense, well, some people will just keep the current status quo until such time we get a proper proper thing put forward to us. I got to understand that. Yeah, I can understand that sentiment. I mean, look, that really, that was deliberately done as well. I think, and also too, I also want to mention about Republican Australia Day, and that this is not a left wing, right wing issue either. And I think we've better got to have to get beyond that. It's a class issue. More, there's actually people who have got conservative views who actually do believe the date should be changed. We should be a republic. We should be quite a few other things as well. And I think we've got, obviously they still want to maintain a certain status quo, like the rule capitalism and all that. But at the end of the day, they do believe a few things that need to be changed. So when I have to take a step back and look at the whole situation, this is not, left wing on one side, right wing on the other moving forward. This is an actual working class issue. And I think for a lot of this, I think that's what's been missing in the discussion, a class issue or a class line put forward through it as well. Because Luke made it interesting. I'll just probably put the question up there about the two-party thing. I'm not going to talk about the two-party. I'll mention it a little bit later. But reality is, what COVID's done is obviously, really it's exposed how sick, what the system's like. It's not there for all of us. It's there mainly to make profit. We live under a system of profits in command. And that's actually what I wanted to get to. We can change the day. We can become a republic. But do we still want to have a system where profits are in command? And that's got to be the fundamental question in all this.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that, because obviously one force that's emerged during the pandemic has been the sort of United Australia Party, the kind of right populists. And I think that in this next election, in the next couple of months, I think that's going to be a really interesting kind of like to see how much people vote for them purely out of protestation. I wouldn't blame people for voting for them in the sense that, there's a reason why the United Australia Party emulate Trump so much. They're very obvious about how they are, their affiliation, right? And I would be very interested to see how much votes they gain, because I guarantee they're going to gain a lot. A lot of people are going to vote for them. How much? I don't know. How many seats they'll win? I don't know. It's hard to tell. But in terms of breaking the two-party duopoly, that is ultimately the difference between Australia and America in terms of the third party is that we have a ton of micro parties, and a bunch of them do have sort of seats in the crossbench. Not a ton, but there's a few. But there's no real unified alternative. There is none. I think that's what the right populists are trying to do with the United Australia Party. They're trying to create a third party, basically. And I think that really, in terms of how we approach things, in terms of the third party, as sort of progressives, communists in a sense, we have to think about the popular front. We have to think about a sort of an alternative coalition of popular democratic forces, which aren't united on the basis of some kind of allegiance to just the union party, the union bureaucracy, which is Labor is really bundled up with, but it's a rank and file, bottom up popular movement that is concerned with the democratic republic question and these issues. Again, because the democratic struggle is ongoing, and COVID has exposed a lot of the sort of how arbitrary power is in this country. People the government can just go out and really oppress its own subjects, and there's not much you can do about it. We're kind of just helpless to it. And I think that there is a democratic awakening. The protests that are happening in response to the vaccine mandates, for example, there is a lot of the left has just totally dismisses them. The CFMEU leadership called them all neo-Nazis, for one. The sort of the communists sort of very much dismiss it by saying, they're just talking about freedom. But it's dude, that's a reflection of the democratic struggle. It's to dismiss the call for freedom. Yeah, it's abstract and it's it's spontaneous, right? But the response from the communists isn't to be this is meaningless. This is just meaningless, or this is all just American influence. It's a total lack of engagement with what is the material underlying sort of what is putting people into the streets. Is it just propaganda? I don't think so. That's kind of an idealist view where it's just the ideas in people's heads, they're being influenced by these ideas in the media. Kevin Rudd, who, by the way, is an associate of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which is funded by the United States deep state, who is one of these people who is calling against the Murdoch media. They all kind of it's the same kind of position where they kind of they just blame the right wing media for where this populism is coming from, and it's it's totally diluted because there is something material underlying these sort of sentiments. It's not just propaganda. It's not just ideas. It's not just the media. There is something more material that's happening here, and communists, scientific socialists are the ones that have to be the ones who are able to give expression to this material striving for democracy in this country, which is if you look at the protests, they're all waving the Eureka flag, which the Eureka flag has been kind of it's been kind of diluted by the union movement into just an economistic kind of thing about wages. It's all about, and I guess particularly obviously the workers' rights, etc. But Eureka was not just about it's not just class in terms of the sort of crude economic sense. It was also about democracy, and the fact that it's waved. What's the slogan? It's that what's the slogan? It was we stand by the Eureka flag. We pledge allegiance to the Eureka flag to defend our rights and liberties. And it was also inspired by the Americans as well. It always comes back to that, and I think that for the union movement has sort of a lot of people when they look at the Eureka flag, they do sort of see a sort of cynicism behind the way the unions use it. That it's like this is not what this was about. It was about democracy. It was about liberty, etc. And they're not wrong. Is the thing. They're not actually that wrong. But that's I think the role of the communists is to sort of combine this democratic history with the sort of class history. It's like it's right there. I don't know. That's just my thoughts.
Yeah, that's fine. Dusty, do you want to say anything? Sorry, you've been quiet there.
Sure. I think I got to get at the base, the economic base between some of the discrepancies between Europe, the United States, and Australia. I think Australia is a little bit different situation than Europe, but the reality in the United States and the political situation is only a reflection of this is where the right wing calls them the globalists. We call Marxist-Leninists, we call them the monopoly capitalists. These handful of banking and oil cartels dating back to a few families back to the British Empire. They're here, and they control and manipulate everything in their interest. Every single thing. The government, the media, the culture, the educational system is funded and manipulated to serve their interests and to continue, cement, and maintain both class and national exploitation and oppression. And I think too many people that I think it's good to get involved in democracy movements. We definitely need to return the power to the people. But if you get too caught up in the political structure, I believe you start to get you're too much on the ground. You get too much in the tactics and you lose the strategy, the overall strategy. So here in North Carolina, we have socialists who work for the Democratic Party. Be like, the Democratic Party is more likely to fund this, this, and this. So we got to do that. And I tell people, hey, look at these huge cities in the North that are continually funded by the Democratic Party, that where African American people and black and brown people are in the cities, and as poor people in general are kept in these horrible situations underneath the Democratic Party. So obviously just getting Democrats in the South isn't going to change the economic base. And then if you get people past that, then you get into the Democratic Socialists. Well, why don't we just vote Bernie Sanders? Why don't we have a European-style government? Well, the reality is, because we live in the core country where the monopoly capitalists are, they are so powerful that they no longer need that labor aristocracy. Their power is so omnipotent that they don't need to buy us off. They don't need to give us health care. And we're also the largest military of this economic system. The economic system, imperialism, really is, the petrodollar, backed by energy dominance. And that's why Australians have such buying power. And Americans have, better condition because of this buying power. But they're so omnipotent and strong that they don't see the need to give us health care. They don't see the need to give us even some democratic reform. So what people get caught up in is, if we had the Democrats, if we had the Green Party, if we had ranked choice voting, everything would be fine. If we could just get money out of the political system. When the reality is, we need to change the power. We need to give power to the people. We need all power to the people. We need to build institutions of political and economic power of working class people. We need to take money out of the hands of monopoly capitalists and return it in the hands of the people. And that can be done in a various amount of ways and various amount of strategies. And a various amount of strategies can be used as these tasks can be used as struggles for schools, empower the people, give them a sense of they can do something. But we can't lose fact of that overall strategy. And that overall strategy is exactly as Benign said earlier, is we need to unite we need to build political and economic power, which means we need to, just like the Bolsheviks did, with Stalin united the peasantry with the working class, first against the Tsar, and then against the bourgeoisie. We need to unite the oppressed people, the working class, the international American working class, lower level capitalists, mid-level capitalists, anyone who is dissatisfied by the current order of the so-called globalist monopoly capitalists. And this is what has worked all over the world. This is what worked in Latin America. The anti-neoliberal coalitions are what put Hugo Chavez in the power. What put Evo Morales in the power. I mean, they got so much of these distractions and lies and manipulations that we need independent political infrastructure just to get people to see through the constant barrage of lies they're feeding down our throats. As far as COVID goes, I think it's absolutely disgusting. This political process in the United States, the duopoly here, they really don't give us any say. Like, the monopoly caps are firmly controlled. They can firmly control both parties. And what the political process essentially is a way of dividing the is deepening the rural-urban divide. Mostly Republicans vote Republicans are based out of rural areas. Democrats in the more urban areas. And it's simply two parts of the ruling class of the monopoly capitalists getting the people divided amongst each other. You voted for Trump, you're the evilest thing ever, you're the reason why things are fucked up. You voted for the Democrats, and so on and so forth. Like, this is the lie and the game that they play. And this COVID thing fits right into it. People in rural areas who actually are less at least initially had less problems with COVID because they're more isolated and they're more in rural areas. They drive cars more often. They actually saw less deaths to do to COVID, and then what the monopoly capitalists did when COVID hit. Did they test everybody? No. Did they implement universal health care? No. They immediately bailed out the banks. They immediately put restrictions on small businesses to further consolidate the monopolies. So, I mean, the people are rightfully angry at the small businesses being put out of business. And they're also rightfully angry at the way mandates have been used to attack workers. Well, you better get the vaccine now, which is a personal health choice, or you're going to lose your job. I mean, that is absolutely disgusting. So you can see why people in rural areas are vaccine hesitant. And this is a new vaccine. I watched stuff in Iran. I'm not again. I had the vaccine. I believe it's effective from what I've seen. But I saw recently that the Iranian government, when choosing which vaccines to get, the U.S. was going to offer a limited amount, and the Iranians turned it down because, number one, they didn't know if they're going to get the second dose. And number two, that this is an RNA, which is a different type of vaccine than the more traditional Chinese vaccine. And they actually wanted to go with the more proven traditional type of vaccine. And that's what an oppressed nation did. Now, us as the working class in the United States, and we're oppressed nations here, we don't get any of those choices. It's, hey, you have to take the same people that put the opioids in your community. Now you got a Pfizer. The same people that laid off your mom or grandparents down the street are the ones that is responsible for curing the crisis that they're using to kill off small businesses. I mean, it's absolutely horrendous. We need to build political and economic power of poor, black and brown people, working class in general, against the monopoly capitalists. And we can definitely use some of this sentiment among working class people against the monopolies to do that in any form and shape whatsoever.
Yeah.
And just on that, sorry.
Oh, no, you go.
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment about that. Yeah. With the relation with COVID here now, it's basically been now with the with our federal government, well, not our federal government, the federal government. It basically is now everyone is basically right. You go and fend for yourselves. Your healthcare is your responsibility. They've just completely whitewashed it. It's been open slather the whole lot. So, I mean, the whole thing with the lockdowns, with the anti-mandate, anti-vax, or anti-whatever rallies, that it's not actually an issue between anti-vax and pro-vax or anything like this. Again, it's actually about a class struggle between who controls the actual right agenda. And if I look, when I was looking through the whole thing, especially over the last year, getting back to the new normal or COVID normal, or having to live with COVID, basically you're going to have to get it. But we need to open up because basically profits are in command. And I made this comment before in one of the videos. There's a difference, say, for compared to ourselves, say, with China or Cuba, where they look after their population. Profits are not in command. That's the edge where they can look after it and they've got a way of doing it. Here, we can't. We go, because profits are in command, they dictate it. No, we have to get everyone back open, start spending, make more profit. And, of course, our health is up to the detriment. I mean, I've got mixed feelings about the big rallies and stuff. And, look, I've been certainly got a lot of good criticism, not good criticism, but a lot of criticisms. But also, too, I understand the underlying concern, which actually does, we've all pointed out here, it's been economic. People have been suffering badly for the last 2-3 years economically, with no support, really. We've had JobKeeper, but only lasted for a particular time. But yeah, they've had no genuine support at all, and I'll write it up here in the comment section. And I mean, obviously, with the role of other parties and that coming in, but we've got to do more than that. We have to change the system. It's a system of profits in command of which we live under, and we're talking about want to move Australia forward. Well, we're going to need to address to that fundamental question: do we want to still live under a system where profits are in command, or live under a system where all the major industries, the banks, finance sector, and transport, and all our mines are actually organised under a properly organised, planned economy, where profits are no longer in command, and we are actually able to look after the population and also increase people's material goods, material goods that for the benefit of everyone. And okay, you know what I'm referring to, socialism here, but I mean, this is where we're looking at, because sometimes I look at the whole thing with with a lot of discussions are happening all around the world, but here in particular, it seems to be going around the circle. All right, we'll change that, do this a little bit because it's not a threat to the established kind of status quo, and we'll just keep going and continuing while everyone still suffers at the end of the day. Sorry, Benign, I jumped in there like that.
Oh no, you're right. Yeah, the urban-rural divide is something I'm really interested in as well, because Dave lives in more central Victoria, and I live in Melbourne, so I live in the city. And Melbourne had like the longest and harshest lockdown in the entire world. which is something that's just shocking. We had a long one in 2020, but then we had another one, a long one in 2021, and it really can't be understated just how much that really broke people. I knew people who lost their lives, not because of COVID, but because of the lockdown and the depression and the just like the sheer amount of abuse of substances, and it was a bad time to be in Melbourne this past 2 years. It's been a bad couple of years. And so a lot of the motivation people have, it's totally understandable because and especially now where they've just let Omicron rip, it makes the past 12 2 years seem like a complete joke. Like we suffered like in these lockdowns for such a long time, and some people's lives were destroyed, and now it's just a million cases or whatever. It doesn't matter. Like it's I mean, obviously Omicron's different, like that's a given, but I think there's a overall sense of like, what the bloody hell happened to us? What did we let the government do to us for the past 2 years? And there's just no accountability for it. There's nothing, like if the government, commits these crimes against population, there's no accountability. There's no local organization, there's no grassroots accountability for the government. It's all arbitrary. It's an arbitrary use of power, and people rightly see it as bullshit, just to return to the urban-rural thing, this is also a big contradiction with the lockdowns, because so many. I remember last year, 2020, sorry, because last year was 2021. In 2020, like the rural Victoria was on a different set of rules than metro. But there was a time where they weren't, and it was really like negatively received, because it was like, well, why do we have to be under the same conditions as Melbourne? And but going beyond COVID, in terms of the rural-urban divide, you do see that in terms of the political difference. Nationals and independents are very popular in rural Australia, whereas Labor, which has moved from being a purely working class party to being a party split between the professional managerials and the working class. So Labor it's ironic that it's called Labor. It's sort of similar to what's happened with the British Labour Party as well. Very similar. It has strong footing in the cities. It has absolutely no reception in the country, but beyond some rural city centres like Ballarat and such. Labor has no way to sort of deal with this contradiction between city and country, and and like I mentioned earlier, Katter, he's I think, what's his seat called? Kennedy. It's like one of the largest seats in the entire country in terms of like its like sheer size. And people, and in the country, people trust their local MPs a lot more. It's like even when like the Nationals betray them, it's like just the fact that they're from their community is enough to be like, well, they're representing us, And it might be, sort of surface level. People know that they're corrupt, but it's like, who else would you go for? Labor? They don't represent us, Liberals as well. Liberals, there's a massive divide in the Liberal Party as well, between the sort of like moderate, quote unquote, Turnbull types, small L liberals, who also, by the way, Malcolm Turnbull, our former Liberal Prime Minister, is a Republican of the worst variety, the absolute worst variety. And I think it's part of why, like, if that's the face of the Republican movement, who would want to be a Republican? Because who the bloody hell likes Malcolm Turnbull, So I don't know. It's the Conservative side. That's where the United Australia Party is getting its sort of Craig Kelly. These different politicians, they came from the kind of conservative side of the Liberal Party. So it's interesting to see the kind of like where the conservative side of the Liberal Party getting its base from, which is more broad than just the liberal moderates, which have a big foothold in like Eastern Sydney, like the sort of more bougie parts of society. But there is also like a kind of a working class or middle class sort of side to the Liberals' base, the Conservative side at least. And I think any kind of popular movement has to recognise where that kind of sentiment's coming from the national side and from the Conservative Liberal side. And also the dissatisfaction in Labor, because a lot of people vote Labor, but they don't like they don't like where it's going. They don't like the direction the party's taken. And the current leader, Anthony Albanese, is he's real feckless, real feckless. So I think there's a real time of political realignment happening, and it's happening more quickly in America. I think what people think by left and right is sort of breaking down, because the Democrats are definitely getting more authoritarian, more right wing. They're aligning with the neocons, anything against Trump. So like you have George Bush is now like an honorary Democrat. It's an incredible realignment that's happening. That's sort of showing how worthless these the way we currently think about left and right is, and I think a new power, a new political realignment is in its early stages of happening, and it's natural that aligns with a crisis in the mode of production as we enter into as the fourth industrial revolution is accelerating, and we have more and more of a contradiction between the big tech monopolies and obviously pharma and the people. We're gonna see more and more kind of breaking down of this sort of like arbitrary left-right distinction, and a new left-right distinction will emerge. And I think that's what we'll see with any kind of new popular force, is that it will start, I think, from an understanding that the left-right is sort of bollocks, but then a new one will emerge. It's sort of what I predict, at least. And I think it's positive. I think I'm really like energized by what's happening in America. I think America is the center of a lot of the changes happening. The revolutionary kind of energy in America it gives me hope. Like I was raised in sort of like the George Bush, like you said, the kind of like Iraq War era, and I thought Americans were all just like jingoistic imperialists. But as those wars kind of showed themselves to be against the interests of both the American people as well as obviously the Iraqi and Afghani people, and also the crackdown on civil liberties with like the Patriot Act and et cetera. We really see how that's why Trump's so much of his appeal was, well, like a lot of his rhetoric at least was being against the wars and rightly calling out how the kind of interventionist sort of globalist sort of like position that the Democrat, like represented by Hillary Clinton and Bush, the Clinton-Bush sort of families, that there was a rejection of it, and the people of America, I don't think, are for imperialism. Like, the old thing about the labor aristocracy, that's completely broken down, and it's been breaking down since the 70s, but it's accelerated since the Wall Street collapse in 2008, and the appetite for peace and for focusing on developing and working for the government to actually work for the American people, I think that's very promising. I do believe that there is a positive future ahead, even if it does get troublesome. But I am optimistic, honestly.
Yeah, and
Hey, I think
sorry,
we're getting on in our time. So I just I really liked how Benign ended it on a positive note. Maybe I think if I could continue and David could close it up for us. And I think you're absolutely right about how, this is like the best of times and the worst of times. Things are getting worse. They threw out the labor aristocracy. Conditions are worsening. And, that's bad. But it's also hope that people will throw off the old ideologies and throw off the old myths, because they're no longer working for us. They'll start looking for alternatives. And socialism, a more advanced society, controlled by the people, popularly controlled, and then having the centers of economic power, the banks, the transportation, etc., planned by the people for the people's benefit, and cutting off the chaos of production, really is our way out. And if I got to talk about patriotism, I often talk about how U.S. patriotism actually caring about the working people, caring about the international proletariat in the United States, wanting the lives of Americans to get better, make America great for the first time, revolutionary patriotism. True patriotism requires anti-imperialism, and true patriotism requires internationalism, because you're not going to improve the lives of the people by sucking up the monopoly capitalists that are destroying our lives. So it has to be against monopoly capitalists. It has to be against the imperialists. And you're not going to fight against the monopoly capitalists without standing shoulder to shoulder with the people around the world to be impressed by the same monopolies. So U.S. patriotism requires anti-imperialism and internationalism. And we got to stick together. There's an old Union saying, in our unity lies our strength. And that's where it goes. So folks in Australia, folks here listening, people are going to come to you. You got to be honest with them, respect where they're coming from, and then just offer whatever insight you have to push them in a direction that, you can work together to build as much power as possible to improve the conditions. You improve the conditions, you come into conflict with the monopoly capitalists, and then from that class struggle is how history moves forward. Comrade Fox, you could end it for us.
Yes, well, look, I'll just before we wind up, it's been an excellent discussion today. Certainly, there's a lot more we could discuss, but obviously time limits itself with that. But I think it's probably emphasised putting on here. We need to change the system, not just the government and all the head of state. And for us here in Australia, it's a very vital, important thing. I heard this great line the other day by Any Means Necessary, which is a Washington-based radio show, but they're very pro-union. But I heard the best line: if you want to resolve a national oppression and racism, best place to put it is on a picket line, because everyone's economic interests are out there, and you break through all that. And I thought, well, that was outstanding when you hear it. It's only through unity of struggle that we actually have realised that we've got more in common than different, and we've got to rebuild that again, because we are being consistently kept divided at the moment over many things. So we'll finish it off today. We'll be back again next weekend, 8 o'clock US standard time, 8 p.m. US standard time on Saturday night, and then 12 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time on the Sunday. So what we do, we always put our fists in the air, and we'll finish it off here with, and you repeat after me, is dare to struggle.
Dare to struggle.
Dare to struggle.
Dare to win.
Dare to win.
All
Dare
power
to win.
the people.
All power to the people.
All power to the people. Right on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys.